I'm back again, and as they just said, I'll be talking about event design and event first development. I introduced myself just previously, but if you've just kind of tuned in, my name is Dave Boyne. I'm a senior developer advocate at AWS. I focus on event architectures and serverless. So previously worked in startups, enterprises, and build tooling around it. So anything event driven, I just kind of love this stuff. So I'm going to start this session off actually with this, which is the adoption of event-driven architecture. It's growing, okay? So if you've been in this space for a few years, you see this term EDA, event-driven architecture, just coming out everywhere really in the community, and people building event-driven architectures. And it's quite funny because when you look back, we actually been building event architectures using messages and using events for decades, right? So that's quite interesting. It's quite interesting to understand why event architecture is becoming popular is because they're becoming kind of more and more accessible to us. And here are some AWS services. So let's start with EventBridge. You know, personally, one of my favorite services. We can use EventBridge, a fully managed event bus, to publish events inside our architecture, inside our domains. We have Lambda here, for example. You know, the serverless compute, being able to trigger compute based on events, based on something happening. Now, if we couple that with API Gateway as an example, we can trigger Lambda using HTTP requests. Okay, something has happened. DynamoDB here as an example, we can listen to changes, we can listen to change, creation, updates, and deletes, and then also we have things like step functions being able to orchestrate this business logic, again triggering off events. And when we look at event architectures, we're told that we can have this decoupled architecture. Let's go for it. We have order service, we have fulfillment service, so we can use things like queues, or an example here, we can use things like event buses, being able to kind of decouple this architecture so we can move fast in our organization, have this agility that we're promised. And also a big thing that we can do is actually also have this evolutionary architecture. What this allows us to do is actually, if we're already publishing events, we can actually kind of evolve our architecture, maybe listen to events that have already been published and kind of add different domains, add different microservices onto this. So when you're in this ecosystem of event-driven architectures, you see these terms come up. You see loosely coupled, we see extensibility, and also agility. I've worked in places before building kind of event architectures on AWS in serverless technology, and the agility is just through the roof. This is why I'm so fascinated by event architectures, because you can seriously get some fast-going applications rocking. Now, the thing is with event-driven architectures, like most architectures, most things we do, right, is as you start to scale event-driven architectures, is interesting problems start to emerge. Now, if we have a look at some of these issues, you will see we have things like producer and consumer responsibilities. Who is responsible for what? We have actually coupling services with the event contracts itself. So we decoupled by nature because we're using an event bus, but we are coupled with the event design, the event, the payloads. Here also we have lack of standards and lack of governance might be an issue, which I talked about previously in a session today. And also here, like unclear event intent. If we have 100 events or 1,000 events, how do we make sure that we've got the right event intent? Is the naming conventions right? Exposing implementation details is quite a common one. How much information should I expose? How much information should be in my events? And also the problem of focusing too much on implementation versus behavior and finding this balance there. And what I kind of realized really too is how you actually design your events impacts your architecture, which is often a thing we overlook when we're building event-driven architectures. And this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in this session today, is understanding event patterns and the trade-offs. Which one should I pick? And also think about what I like to call event-first thinking. So what is this? And at the end of that, we have a summary of resources. Now, where do the problems start? As we have this kind of flow here. We have the requirement, we also have the design and implement. So when an event, when you get requirement comes in, most applications, most things, this is how we kind of build things, right? We get a requirement, you need to raise an event. Someone's interested in something. Okay, so I'll raise the event, I'll come in, I'll design the event, and then I will implement it downstream. Now, here is an example application which I'm going to be talking to Eric and Jessica in a second about, but here's an example application with some team topologies. So here I'm the order service. We have Jessica, who's the invoice service, and we have Eric, who is the fulfillment service here. Now, new requirements come in from the team. So you can see Jessica here, she says, okay, I want an order, I want to invoice a customer when an order has been created, as an example. Eric says, I also want to know when the order has been created because I want to do some fulfillment stuff. So me as the order service says, okay, that's cool. I'm going to use an event bus here. And I'm going to use some events to notify these downstream consumers that something has happened. Now, what I do with my event design is up to me, right? So what I can do here is I can create a payload. Now, if you're used to EventBridge, you might be used to this kind of payload here. If you're not, there are three things I'm going to shout out. We have the detail type, which is the event name itself. So you can see this is the order created event. We also have the source. So people tend to use the source as the domain. So I have myapp.orders here, which is the orders domain. Now, the detail is the interesting part. This detail, this bit here is up to you. The envelope of the event is up to you. So what I'm going to do here is actually, we're going to be talking about this. And what I'd like to ask Eric and Jessica here too is about what do you think as a consumer, what are the trade-offs with this event pattern?
Well, I think the first one is that the contract is simple and that it's easy to maintain for the producer. Eric?
Yeah, I agree that the maintenance is important, but I also think it's just a simple notification, hey, the order happened, right?
Yeah.
There's not everything you need, but there is something has happened, this is an event. I've always, as you know, I define serverless and event-driven article as something happened and we do something. Or what did I say? Architecture.
You said architecture.
Yeah. Hey, he said rooting. So
that's true. I mean, I think we're just inventing words today.
That's right.
It's exactly that. So here I'm sending, and we call these like notification events. So what I'm doing is I'm sending some minimal information here with the contract. So you can see we have the order and we have the user ID. Now, these are called notification events. They're simple in contract. They actually have a name when we're designing our events. They're designed not really for the consumer, and I'll explain why in a second. And also we have easy to get started with, but come at a cost.
Do you use the term sparse? Because a lot of times we'll use sparse events as well.
Yeah, that's correct.
So,
so
if you've seen sparse as well.
Yeah, and notification events, the same thing, yeah.
Okay.
So here's an example of a trade-off, something you might happen, which has happened to me in the past. So what tends to happen here is you have the downstream consumers actually requesting to get more information. So again, we're decoupled on paper, but what happens is you raise the event, downstream consumer says, thank you very much for the order ID. Now I need to go somewhere to get this information. Now, the interesting thing here is this might not be a problem, but what you want to do is actually think about these designs up front. So what happened to me in a previous job is I come in one day and we thought the application that we were building went viral, right? Because we saw our GraphQL endpoint taking loads of hits. And that was not the case. It was the case that we had more and more consumers going back to the producer, going back to a service to get more and more information.
So is this enough information for the event? Like, what if we need more than what's just being provided?
Correct, yeah, so there's other events, other event types that we can use to process some information, which I'm going to go through in a second actually, but to kind of summarize notification events, we have this kind of simple contract, but remember we also have this coupling between this requests rather than the contract, because from a producer's point of view, the contract is simple. So when I have to maintain this in 12 months or 18 months time, there's not a lot for me to maintain because it's just two IDs and an event. I like to think of this as a pull model because consumers pull information down, but also if you're using things like EventBridge, I really recommend considering other types of events, maybe because you also have limited filtering or routing here on your event bus. So let's rewind, let's go back. And let's say, okay, let's change how much information that we are going to push out here. In fact, I decide as the order service to say, I'm going to give you more information. Now, there doesn't seem to be too much information on here, but that's just because of the space of the slide. But let's, make sure, let's pretend there's more and more information here. So the question I have back to Jessica and Eric is, what do you think the trade-offs are with this particular pattern if you've got this information?
Well, I think obviously there is more information, and that's given to your downstream consumers. And as a result, you no longer have to go back and get more information because you have it here, right?
It's less chatty.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's less chatty. I would also say that as you're talking about moving downstream and filtering, you have more information to filter on.
Yeah.
So I think that's a positive.
Well, the more information, the more data, the more granular you can get. You have more breadth for whatever you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly, yeah. So one thing Eric just mentioned here exactly is the interesting thing about these events with more data is we can have more kind of filtering and routing or routing options. I have to say that.
Now you're paranoid.
Just the Linux person in me, every time I hear routing, I'm like, who's doing sudo on these paths, on these routes?
But exactly that. So we have more information. We could do more different kind of routing with the consumer. So Eric, in this example, you might say, I'm only interested in events or orders that are $50 or $100 or whatever else. So I have more information. But again, considering we call these event carried state transfer events, which is we allow consumers to be autonomous, flexible with filters and rules, but again, they come at a particular cost. So let's have a quick look at these costs here. We have here, for example, we have the amount, okay? So this is amount, I say amount 50. Now, the question is, when you look at this event as a consumer, what is that amount in? Is it dollars? Is it in sterling? Is it in cents or pence? Who knows? Is this too much information? As the order service, am I publishing too much implementation details in my event here? So things to consider, and things like postcode, right? Delivery address, postcode, that's a UK thing, or zip codes. What about the rest of the address? So am I expecting downstream consumers to get this information or not? So there are things, again, to consider. And then finally at the bottom there, we also have PII information.
Right.
Okay, should we be raising events with PII information? Depends on the kind of use case.
Yeah. Now, is this too much information though? Sorry, because I'm looking at now you do have, it's a lot more granular, right?
Yeah.
You can really drill down into this. You can expand the breadth of your application, but I know you said it's less chatty. The more information you have, is there any advantages, disadvantages to kind of drilling down and pulling out just whatever key or value you want?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to pile on top of that for a minute too. And I don't know if you did this on purpose, but I'm looking at the PII one, and you notice first name is uppercase N, but last name is not.
Yeah.
Now, that may just be an accident. I'm embarrassing you. That's not the point here. But what's interesting here is, if you were to send this out, people started using this, and they changed that. They're using last name lowercase.
Right.
But someone else expected uppercase.
Yeah.
Now you have to support both.
Yeah.
Right.
And so these can get really big as you're maintaining them. So it's a maintenance thing.
Right.
Exactly that. So
You did it on purpose, didn't you?
No, but I love that. So it goes me into the next slide. I do love that. Natural. So we have event carry state transfer. So the difference here is the contracts are bigger. So me as a producer, I have to maintain this contract. As you just said, that last name, right? That field there is, if I change this in the future because I realize my mistakes, I may break downstream consumers. These are things we have to consider. We are in the middle here, I said coupling. So we are coupling with contracts rather than requests. So we publishing this information, and now we have a contract between producers and consumers that we need to maintain. That probably me as the producer needs to maintain. It's this kind of push model, so I'm pushing state and information downstream, and also we spoke about the filtering options that kind of these events give you. Now, if we continue along this route, and I'll kind of just fly through some more examples quickly here, we have even things like delta events, sending the previous amount and the new amount. So, and change data capture with Dynamo might do this for you, the previous data in the database and the new data. But these are things you might want to consider doing. An example is you give downstream consumers this information so they can do something useful rather than the downstream consumers doing this themselves. So again, we call these delta events. Other types of events that you might have here is things like domain events or integration events. And the way I love to think about this is I am the order service. We have a team of 6 developers here. We might be using an event bus internally. So we're creating events, we're using events, we have these big events, these small events, but we have more control because it's within our domain. Now, as soon as we raise integration events, with different teams, with Jessica and Erica, for example, we have this different kind of mentality of these events. So we call these integration events. The contracts are very more special to us rather than things that are internal. So things to consider there between even private events and integration events. And I said about this in the previous session, but I think this is super important too, is about how we even consume events as consumers. Do we conform to that model, conform to that pattern within that domain, or do we use things like anti-corruption layers to map events into language, into a domain that we understand? Or do we go here over onto the open host service and we all agree on a standard as a team, and these are the standards and these are the events that we're going to raise in our company? So if you want to learn more about that, I really recommend checking out bounded context mappings. Now, the question you probably sat there wondering is, okay, Dave, that's great, but just tell me, please, which event pattern I should use so I can go and build some event architectures. And of course, it's not as simple as that. We've got to kind of consider these different trade-offs. But the thing is you should kind of consider really is just understanding the differences, right? It's so easy to just build, I call them YOLO events, but just build events and write events without standards or thinking about it. You could end up in a bit of a mess. So think about notification events. Does it make sense to use that here? To think about, do we need more state in our events? Do we want to do more routing in our event bus as an example? Do we want to have them more stateful or delta events or internal and external? So many different event types. And when I kind of abstract this into a high level, what I really recommend you do is treat events as kind of first-class citizens in your design. So I say here, a great event design means moving to what I like to think about event-first thinking. And I mentioned this slide earlier, is when we get events, when we get requirements inside of our teams, this is the way we kind of think about events, right? We have a requirement, we design it, and we implement it. But the difference is, I've worked with teams in the past when we design APIs as an example. We have this high standards, this natural high standards as a community with APIs, that we have versioning APIs, we have specs for our APIs. We can't make breaking changes in our APIs. We need to have that same level with our events, and that can really help you build event architectures. So rather than doing requirement, design, and then implement, what I really recommend is just focusing on something different. Thinking about identifying events. There is a talk here that dives deeper. I've done this last year. But think about identifying events. Use things like event modeling or event storming, and you can search for these things. Come together and collaborate on your events and bring them up outside of these teams into this organization, and understand the behavior can really help you understand and build your event architectures. Think about defining, as we identify them, how do we define the events within our domains and our aggregates? And then finally, implementation. Do we want to have standards in our events? What kind of event? What about the naming? Do we use notification events or carried state transfer? What makes sense where? Think about them, and they can really kind of help you deliver this event-driven architecture systems over time. I just want to kind of summarize this session. We spoke about a lot about events, and we spoke about at the start. I spoke about this event-driven architecture, how it's growing, and you can see this in the community, and how AWS services are making this a lot easier for us to implement. And you can see here what I kind of distilled it all down to too is as we design our architectures, is how you actually design your events will impact your architecture. I can probably almost guarantee it. I've been there in the past and kind of felt that pain. So think about event types, think about notification events, right? Think about, do you want these sparse events, or do you want to add more state inside of the events and publish this downstream? Delta events, again, the before and the after. Do consumers really need to do that themselves? Do they need to go somewhere else and process that? Or could you just raise that in your event? Is this a pattern you can use? And also, Again, I mentioned this internal and external events. Integration events versus internal events are completely different. They may look the same, but they're completely different in contract, in schema. As I said before, if I have a team of people with me, we have more control on the event types and the schemas and the contracts versus the event types and the schemas that we may have for other people. We have to keep that contract alive. So how do we do that? We spoke about this, I spoke about this again, that requirement design and implement, and the key really here is just to reshape this, rethink this. And again, what I say here is think about something called like event first thinking. Identify events, define them, and implement them. And if you're interested in learning more about this whole topic, we have serverlessland.com, which is a website. We have over 500 serverless patterns. We have workflows, we have snippets, we have EDA guides on there now. We have serverless testing guides on there. We have loads and loads of stuff. One thing I've been doing since January is this EDA visuals, which has become super popular with people. I'm pretty proud of that, and it's great to see people use this. But if you've got 5 minutes spare, come inside of EDA visuals, look at a bite-sized learning, read it, and then I have tons of resources on every visual for you to dive deeper. And also you can download these offline. There's like an 80-page PDF you can download again to dive deeper or dish them out to your teams. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the session and dive deep inside your event designs, and that can kind of help you build your event architectures. And thank you very much for having me and watching.